In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a little summer dress. For this project, we're going to need scissors, elastic, pins, fabric, and then I used a thinner fabric for the details, zip ties or boning, paper, pen, and ruler, and then some thread. So we're going to start by creating the front piece of our dress, and we're just going to create a fold over line so we know our center front, and then we're going to create some gathering around the bust. Then I'm going to mark out here where I want to place my side seam. Instead of folding your fabric, you could also use a pencil or a pen to create these markings. Then I also placed my elastic just to give me a guide of how I want the top to fit. Then I'm going to cut around my side seams, leaving some seam allowance to play around with. Here I'm just ironing out my center front seam as well as my side seam and the seam that's going to attach to the sleeve just to get a better idea of what it's going to look like when it's all finished. I'm also correcting and trimming away the seam allowance. I now have the basic shape of my bust piece completed, and before I continue on with the pattern, I want to add the details onto this test piece to see what the actual dress is going to look like. So I know I want to add a frill detail at the neckline, and here I'm just playing with a piece of extra fabric to determine how thick and how long I want this piece to be. I also need to figure out how to attach it while including a piece of elastic, and I've decided to use a bias strip. I do think it's really important to create mock-ups when you can, so you can work out all the kinks when creating your details before you actually work on your final piece. I'm now going to sew a basting stitch along the bottom of my piece, finish off the front hem, and sew down the bias strip that I just created. I can now pull in that loose thread from my basting stitch to see what kind of gather it's going to give me. And then attaching a safety pin to my elastic, I'm going to push it through the channel I created with my bias strip. And then I can lock the elastic into place, stitching it down at each end. Again, the whole point of this is just to create a close enough mock-up that when I create the actual garment, I know exactly the steps I need to do. Now I'm ready to create my back piece, which I'm going to do by just pinning it on the mannequin and lining up my side seam and my back seam, and then cutting away any of the extra fabric. I can then use my measuring tape to make sure that I'm leaving a 1 centimeter seam allowance along all of the edges. Finally, we're going to drape the sleeve. Okay, so for this, we want to attach it to the front piece and to our back piece, and we want to attach it all the way along the edge of our front piece. We can also trim away as much excess as we can throughout this process to make it a little easier. And we want to pin it underneath the arm a little bit. We want to make sure that we're leaving a 1 centimeter seam allowance around every edge of this piece. We will be adding elastic around the arm and on the shoulder of this piece. So now we've created 3 pieces to our pattern that are going to create the top bust of this dress. Before we trace this onto some paper, we want to make marks to make sure that we know how these pieces are going to attach and where. For example, we want to know where the sleeve is hitting the back piece, and we also want to know how much of the underarm we're going to sew into that sleeve. And then once we have it all traced, we can cut out those pattern pieces, making sure again to write as much information on those pieces as we can so we don't forget when we're cutting it out of our real fabric. And we're also making sure that all of these pieces include the right amount of seam allowance. Now with our pattern done, we can cut out all 3 of these pieces, plus their mirror image, to have 6 pieces of our pattern. I'm using some recycled fabric that actually already has a channel, so I'm lining up my seam allowance accordingly. And here are my mirrored pieces for my front, and I'm going to do the same for the 2 other pattern pieces. Making sure to mark out those notches with a tiny little slit for mostly the back piece and the sleeve. I'm going to start by attaching my front and back pieces, and then I'm also going to do my basting stitch just like we did on the mock-up. And then I can pull my basting stitch. A lot of these steps are going to be the exact same as we did for the mock-up piece that we already created. So next I'm going to cut out 2 bias strips just like how I did for the mock-up, and then I'm going to cut 2 strips of fabric that I'm going to use as the frill detail. Another benefit of doing the mock-up is now I know the look I like for this frill detail with regards to how close I want the folds or the width I want for this piece. So now I'm just going to prepare this piece, making sure that it's a nice rectangle to work with and that both of my seam allowance at either end are folded in 1 centimeter. So I have no raw edges poking out at either end of this rectangle. So now my bias strip, my bust piece, and my frill detail, and I can just pin and iron until I like the way it looks and making sure that it fits nicely onto this piece. You can make any adjustments as well to make sure that the spacing is nice and even. Now we're going to take the right side of our frill piece, place it on the right side of our bust piece, and then place facing down the right side of our bias strip, making sure to tuck in 1 centimeter seam allowance on either end of that strip. And then we can sew along with a straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then removing the pins, we're going to iron this piece out. Then we can fold over our fabric from our bias strip, making sure to leave enough room to create that channel for our elastic, and in turn tucking in all the raw edges. And then we can pin that down and sew along where we pinned. So now we're creating a channel for that elastic that also locks in all the raw edges. Then with our safety pin on our elastic, we can poke the elastic through the channel and place the pin at each end to lock it into place. Now we're ready to insert our zip ties. And we're going to place these in the center front seam allowance that also acts as a channel. If your zip tie is a little thinner, like in my case, I'm going to do a top stitch at the front to keep that in place. That's also going to lock in the elastic. So now we're just doing a couple stitches to lock in the elastic and the zip tie. Now with our front piece done, we're ready to move on to the sleeve. So we're going to create the same detail along the neckline of the sleeve, so on the shoulder part of the sleeve. Creating that same frill detail, again using that bias strip technique to lock that in place. Tucking in the seam allowance of the frill detail, folding it, ironing it, pinning it down, and then placing the same order of the sleeve, right sides with the frill detail, and locked in with the bias strip. And then like we did with the bust piece, we're going to iron that piece out, tucking in the seam allowance of the bias strip, folding it over about 1 centimeter, leaving enough room for the elastic detail, and then sewing that down. And now we can sew the seam to our underarm, which should be marked out with little notches. If you're feeling fancy, you can use a French seam for this stitch. And now we can insert our elastic into that channel, again placing pins and locking it down with a stitch on either end. And then I want you to do the exact same mirror image for the other bust and sleeve piece. And once we're done, we can pin all those 4 pieces together. We want to make sure that our underarm seam on the sleeve is matching up with our side seam. And then we can sew all of those seams with a straight stitch. And then cut away any of the excess threads, fabric, or elastic. The final step of the pattern is going to be the bottom of the dress, which I'm just doing a half circle skirt that I'm going to cut out of 2 pieces. And I'm going to sew those 2 pieces together at just one of the seams, leaving one of the seams open. And you can use a French seam for this as well. And now we're going to pin the top and the skirt pieces together. We're going to place right sides together, and as you can see, we're leaving the excess 2 centimeters on either side of the front bust pieces. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned. Now going back to our pattern pieces, we want to cut 2 extra mirror image back pieces for this pattern. And we're going to use these to clean up the inside of this dress. So placing right sides together, we're going to attach them at the center back seam, while making sure the wrong side is facing the wrong side of the dress. And then we want to fold in that 1 centimeter seam allowance on the outside edges. And then we're going to attach it right sides together on the top side of that entire back piece, catching all of those raw edges from the sleeves and the back pieces of the dress. And then we can sew the back seam and then sew along where we pinned. And then we can iron what we just sewed to create a nice crisp edge. And then iron your seam allowance up from where the skirt piece attaches, and then fold over 1 centimeter on the bottom of the added back pieces. And then we're going to pin along the seams to lock that piece in place. And as you can see, by adding this detail, it locks in so many of your raw edges. And then you can sew along where you pinned. Now we're moving back to the sleeves, and we want to measure the length that we want for the elastic so that it hugs comfortably around the top of our arm with a 1 cm seam allowance. And we're going to use the same bias strip technique that we've used around every other edge to create the channel for our elastic. So using that strip of fabric, we're going to sew our two ends right sides together, and then we're going to place the right side of this on the right side of our fabric and sew it along the edge of the sleeve. And then we can iron that out, fold over a bit of the seam allowance, fold it over again, and there we have our channel. And we want to make sure it's wide enough to fit in our elastic. We want to leave open a little section so we can insert our elastic when we're done sewing. So we're going to sew along the edge, leaving open about 2 centimeters, and then we're going to insert our elastic into that opening. And then with a pin, we can attach the two ends of the elastic together. And then we're going to sew that with a zigzag stitch and then close the channel. And here we're just closing off that channel with the attached elastic tucked inside. And we're going to do that for both sleeves. Now moving on to the front of the dress, we're ready to attach the two front pieces, keeping in mind that there's an extra 2 centimeters seam allowance on either side of these pieces. We don't want that extra seam allowance at the bottom of the dress, so we're going to pin leaving 2 centimeters seam allowance. Other important step here is that we're leaving an opening that's big enough that we're able to pull the dress over our shoulders. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned. I used a French seam. Now, being very careful not to cut beyond the seam, we're going to cut a small little notch right at the top of the seam that we just sewed. This will allow us to fold over that 2 centimeter seam allowance that we have at the top of the dress. So folding it over 1 centimeter and then folding it over again another centimeter. And we're going to do that for both sides, folding it over 1 centimeter and then again folding it over another centimeter. And that creates the slit detail at the front. Now before sewing that down, we want to create our straps. I'm just making mine out of the same fabric of the dress, but you can use any fabric you like or even use an existing ribbon if you have one. So I'm just tucking in all the raw edges and then I'm going to sew along with a straight stitch. Now we can pin those two ribbon pieces into place, and I'm just going to attach them right where the bust pieces hit the dress pieces on that seam. And then I can sew along the slit detail that we created, locking those straps into place. One final optional step is to add bias strips to any of the raw edges to help clean up the inside of the dress. And again, this is the same technique that we've been doing on a lot of our edges for this dress. So placing right sides together the bias strip to the raw edge seam, you're going to iron down the 1 centimeter on either side, fold over 1 centimeter, fold it over again, and then pin it down. And then you can sew along where you pinned. And this is just a really clean way to cover up any of the raw edges and give your dress a better finish. And then the final step is to hem your dress, which we're just going to do by folding it over 1 centimeter and then folding it over again 1 centimeter. It may help to pin it down before you sew. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.